The women's liberation movement was a movement which was really vilified by the press at the time, and people were known as women's libbers and bra burners. But basically, it was simply a movement about liberation. It was a movement about freedom, it was a movement about justice, and it was a movement about freedom and justice which was specifically focused upon women in a period when there were lots of different types of liberation movements going around, and where the idea of justice and freedom was in the air, and that was something that had come out of the 1960s. But to situate it, I think that it's necessary to talk about the whole moment after the Second World War and what happened to my generation. And the Second World War itself was quite important because it gave opportunities for women to work, and women participated in that war in terms which were, if not equal to men, which were equally active to men. And they all had their roles, and creches were provided for them to do work such as in the shipyards and heavy industry, and as well as in the forces, in the armed forces. But after the war, it was assumed that women would go back into the home because that was considered to be their rightful place and the place where they were most naturally happy. This idea about the home being the place where women was most naturally happy was also an idea which had been part of the first wave of feminism. So earlier feminists had argued that women were essentially different from men, and that difference meant that they were more naturally suited for caring for others, for domestic work, for the type of work which would enable them to be good mothers and be good wives. So they were essentially seen as supportive to men. But for the early feminists, the idea had been that this role wasn't secondary and shouldn't be unequal. It ought to be a role that was made equal to the roles which men inhabited in the labour movement. And so people still believed that, I think, by the end of the Second World War, and it was with some relief probably that women went back into the home after the rigours of the war, and it was probably with some relief that they adopted the new fashions, which were essentially about femininity, and it was probably with some relief that they embraced a primary role of childcare without having to rely on the state to look after their children. And this feeling in the 1950s, I think, was softened for women as in terms of equality and inequality by the development of the welfare state, which made lives in the home so much easier than they had been for their parents or their grandparents before the war. So it's important probably to talk about the welfare state and its significance on all our lives. For the generation that was born in the post-war years, and we were a large generation, we benefited quite significantly from the welfare state and its development on all sorts of fronts. The welfare state was predicated upon that idea of women in the home not really being equal, or women being different, and it was predicated on the idea that women would work in the home and that men would be the major breadwinners. But if you put that to one side for a moment, you can see that we had all sorts of gains that came out of the welfare state. We gained from the National Insurance Act, which gave us financial security. I think that was 1946. The National Health Service, which gave us free medical care, and as we always talk about, the free orange juice and the free milk that we had as children, which meant that we all had better health when we were children, and which was less worry for our parents. We benefited from better housing, because there was a massive development of council housing at the time, and we benefited from the 1944 Education Act, which was based on the idea of a meritocracy and equality of opportunity. And the idea in the welfare state was that everybody in a free and democratic society, and you have to remember we'd just been fighting against Hitler and fascism, and so freedom and opportunity were very important, and the struggle against tyranny. So the idea was that we had an open, democratic, free, liberal society where everyone who could take advantage of the society would be enabled to take advantage of their talents. They'd be able to use their talents and make a contribution, and that anybody who was in difficulty or in trouble would be supported by the state, and benefits would be universal and free for everyone. So it was an optimistic view of human nature and human potential. And it's difficult for me, I think, to fully understand it because I was a child at the time. But I think it permeated all our lives. I think we had a sort of security that no previous generation, and especially working class children, we had a sort of security that no previous generation had ever been able to feel. And we thought the world was ours, and that we could be anything, and that we could do anything. That was really, really important for what happened later. I've already said that the systems that were created in the welfare state were based upon this idea of the sexual division of labour, where woman's natural place was in the home and man's natural place was in the workplace. Because it was based on that, and because work in the home never attracted a wage or any status or any place in public life, and because that created a sort of dependence, what was built into it was an inequality between men and women. There was no way in which, even if you had an idea that there was equality, and even if there was an effort through things like family allowance to make women more independent, women were still dependent upon men, and they were dependent upon marriage and motherhood to develop any social status in society. That was what was believed would make them really women. So when we were growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s, we had essentially two contradictory ideas going on in our lives. One idea was that we had equality of opportunity, we had freedom to be what we could be and to do anything that we wanted to be, and that we ought to use our talents. And we had systems to enable that to happen. And then on the other side, there was this belief that our real fulfilment would be found through marriage and motherhood and caring for children and caring for menfolk. For me, that was particularly important in a mining area where there weren't really any jobs for women, and where women were expected to support men doing a very hard job down the mines.